All right, welcome to this episode of Photo Theology, and I'm your host, Doug. And today, what we're going to be looking at is a video that I already did, but I'm redoing, which is the Canon 5D Mark III versus the Pentax K5 2S. Now, my reason for redoing this video is fairly simple. It deals with the fact that I primarily started off with like a 1600 ISO versus just starting at the beginning and then going straight through. That's number one. Number two, when I had done the video, what I did is I downscaled the resolution for the Canon to match the Pentax, which in theory should actually give the Canon the advantage because it reveals, I should say, not releases, but reveals less flaws in the camera in terms of how it makes its image, so on and so forth. So that was it. However, upon the review, there was a lot of skepticism to it in terms of me just wanting to promote the Pentax K5 2S and what have you not. And I decided, you know what? Well, what I'll do is I'll simply just do it like I've done every other video. And I will just match resolution for resolution with a greater resolution. So in this video, what you're going to have is you are going to have ISOs from 100 to 12,800 to begin with. Okay, we'll just get that part out of the way. The second thing is going to be this: is your raw files were processed into TIFF, and then after that processed into JPEG through Corel. I did the same balancing method that I did in the video for the Nikon D7100 setup. So it's exactly the same method here. And I interpolated the Pentex's 16 megapixel to match the Canon's 22.3 megapixel setup. So, this is going to be a case where, everything is going to pretty much be on equal ground. It is what it is kind of thing. So you're going to get to see where we start off with this. But let's get into it. All right. So first off, let's talk about the sensors here. So the Canon 5D Mark III is a premier unit within the Canon lineup. It's been very successful. It's been very popular. A lot of people like it. It is built upon the success of the Canon 5D Mark II. Now, my reason in the very beginning for taking the Pentax K5 2S was because way back in the beginning with Photo Theology, what we did is we took the Canon Mark II, the 5D Mark II, and we put it up against the Pentax K5. Needless to say, the results were astounding. The Pentax K5 in a ISO test with no noise reduction utterly obliterated the Canon. There was no competition between those there. And for some people, that was earth shattering. It was like, come on, you're telling me that a DSLR with a compact sensor can beat out a full frame. Many people didn't want to accept that, but the facts were what they were, and the Pentax K5 2S and the Pentax K5 II are actually both built off of the legacy, literally, of the Pentax K5. Now, likewise, in many respects, I would like to point out that the Canon 5D Mark III is built off of a similar legacy, except that in this case you do have a completely different machine in terms of image output versus the 5D Mark II. When you compare, the Mark II versus the Mark III within the Canon family, there's a night and day difference there. And anybody can tell that once when you start rolling through, I want to say, your resolution tests and your ISO tests and so on and so forth when it comes to that. So you have that. But for this test setup here, what you're looking at is the Canon using its 22.3 megapixel sensor setup going up against the Sony 16 megapixel setup from Pentex's end. So Canon makes their own sensor for this. Pentax gets theirs from Sony. There you go. Now the next thing you're going to be looking at here is you're going to be looking at the Digix 5 processor versus the Prime 2 processor. And this is what's really interesting, because the Digix 5 processor, started off in the highest end Canon unit, their 1D setup that they had going on, and they put it in there. And then what they did is they translated it down to the Mark III, and then of course you have the T4i, which has it as well. And I will be doing a test on the T4i, testing out the concept of the Digix 5 processor and how it relates to a compact sensor-based model. But staying on topic for this, your Digix 5 processor is astounding, because when you talk about the Digix 5 processor in a full frame setup for Canon, comparing the Mark II, the 5D Mark II, to the Mark III, in terms of the power of noise control, in terms of color and clarity, noise control and all that. From a noise control perspective, you're roughly talking about, I want to say, 16 times greater performance. Now Canon says it's 17. I go with 16. How I arrived there is simple. I simply just do it by multipliers of 2. That's what I do. So you go down the camera lineup, you pick cameras that are better in terms of their noise control, which you have to know this factually, and then that's how you're able to arrive to, hey, this unit's 2 times better than this unit's 2 times better than this unit's 2 times better than this, so on and so forth, and that's how you get to my 16 times. Canon somehow gets to a 17 times, so, anyways, we're both within the same ballpark. So I'm pretty happy about that. And I did my stuff way before I even looked at Canon's, readout on what they thought about the unit and what other people had said about the unit, so on and so forth. So I'm pretty happy about that. But on the flip side of that, let's be honest here, the Pentax K5 2S also has the same level of power in terms of noise reduction. It does. I mean, you can look at this, you can tell they're both at the same level. So the Digix 5 processor in the full frame mode has basically brought Canon up to speed where Pentax is with the Sony, compact sensor and its Prime 2 processor, its imaging engine. So now Canon and Pentax are at the same level. Now, there is something that you have to look at when we make these comparisons here. And I'd said this in the last video, and I think this is one of those things that turns people off, is when I start talking about the price. So when you talk about the pricing of the unit, which I could care less whether I turn anybody off or anything, but when you talk about the pricing of the unit, you have to keep in mind that the Canon model that we're talking about here is a 3 gram plus adventure, where the Pentax model that we're talking about here is a $1,200 plus adventure. Now, normally you could sit up here and say, well, I want to have the higher resolutions, I want to have that higher output in terms of image quality, which is true, you can normally say that. But as you see through the means of interpolations with the proper software, you have the same level of quality. If you look at both images, what you end up seeing from a pixel-to-pixel perspective is you're not seeing so much sharpness, neither here nor there, but you're looking at more of, I want to say, the concept of how the dynamic range plays out in the image. Okay, the zone metering and so on and so forth. Those kind of things. Now, from the standpoint of the Digix 5 processor on a full frame unit, and the way they set it up with the Canon 5D Mark III. One of the big, I'm going to say, downsides to this processor is that you do have an inconsistency as you move up and down your ISOs. So in terms of your color balance, I want to say your white balance, your colors and saturations, there is a slight shift that occurs. Now, with every camera, the argument can be made that you have that shift. But with the Mark III, it is noticeable. When I was going through doing the test, this is something that I clearly noticed. The Canon has, a slight yellowish cast to it. Even with, I want to say, its pure white balance setup. You can look at it versus the Pentax, look at the whites, and what have you not. And you're going to notice that you have an off coloring in terms of, color cast, where it's slightly yellow. Instead of being, the more solid color, the more pure color that it could be. So you have that there. But even that actually shifts back and forth through the ISOs as you change, which is part of the irony of everything. It's you build a $3,000 camera, you think they'd get the color system down right. But then again, when you are using a brand new imaging processor, that's got a lot that you got to learn with it, I guess you could say. When you talk about the dynamic range aspect of it, though, like I said, as you move up and down on those ISOs, it automatically shifts with the camera. Now, this is funny because the other brand that does this in terms of dynamic range and does it extremely well is Fuji. So, for example, the way it works with Fuji is they normally start off with 4 times greater dynamic range than everybody else does. A 400% greater dynamic range. However, through your ISOs of, 200 and 400, you're able to actually bump up to, a 1600 ISO setup. Or I'm sorry, not a 1600 ISO setup. I didn't mean to say that. A 1600% dynamic range setup on your ISO. That's what I meant to say. Okay. So the way it works with Fuji is if you bump up to an ISO of 400 with them, you potentially can get 4 times greater dynamic range than what you had before. And that's how it works between, the models there, and the way that they work. And Canon uses an approach that I would arguably say is somewhat similar in that as you move up through your ISOs, your dynamic range does increase. However, you have to be careful about that because you also can incur graininess. Now, when we're talking about sharpness, sharpness does also play along with the ISO as well. I will be the first one to say that I did notice that there was finer detail when I was looking at more of an 18, or not an 18, but an 800 ISO than when I was looking at a 100 ISO. So, in the way, and understand, these ISOs or these files being used are naked ISO noise. This is not me masking anything. I didn't do that. What I did is I balanced out the image in terms of exposure and color, all that from Corel's perspective, and then I just said, okay, let's see what happens. But you do have, as you climb your ISOs, you do actually gain a little more, I would say, sharpness throughout your images. And then, of course, I want to say after like 16, it falls off, and that's when you start losing. So that there is kind of interesting also, I'd have to say, when it comes to, the camera and its naked also, ISO performance. The Pentax, on the other hand, doesn't really have those kind of issues. All right. So, I mean, the sharpness for the Pentax, steadily paces itself. The color balance of the Pentax definitely paces itself. Those are not the kind of issues that you see with the Canon. It's not happening on the Pentax's end. It's not, it's not happening with the Pentax. Now, when we talk about the system for autofocusing, because as you guys know, autofocusing is one of the key essential pieces to a digital camera. What amazes me sometimes is people go out and buy a camera and they go, oh, I want it to shoot faster. And it's like, okay, all right, so, you want it to shoot faster. Well, what do you mean by faster? Well, I hate when I sit up here and press the button, then it takes a picture 5 seconds later. Well, If that's the case, well, your problem is you need a camera that has a good autofocus. But instead, what they're trying to do is they're trying to buy a camera that shoots like 10 frames a second. One of those kind of things, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And that's one of the things that really does go against, a majority of cameras that are built. But that's also what justifies purchasing certain cameras within a lineup. So, for example, the Canon's autofocusing ability is roughly at a 0.12. Okay, so we'll give it that. We'll say it's at a 0.12 for the 5D Mark III, where the Pentax is at a 0.4 or below. Now, a lot of people get caught up into this whole, how many autofocusing points do I have? Like, for example, the Canon, 5D Mark III has 61 autofocusing points total, and then it has 41 cross-focusing points. That's how the camera's set up. And then it has 5 high-performance autofocusing points. Now, I said this about the Nikon D7100. I will say it here again. It does you no good to have 100 autofocusing points built inside a camera when the camera itself does not have this speed when it's being compared to another camera that's going to have a greater autofocusing speed. In other words, what I'm telling you is this, is it's all fine and good that the Canon has 61 autofocusing points, but it comes down to, all right, of those 61 autofocusing points, you already know that 20 of them don't meet the autofocusing speed of the 0.12. You already know that. Now you got 41 left. Of those 41, only 5 of them are high precision. That would mean that realistically, you've only got 5 autofocusing points on that thing that you can turn to and say, look, when it gets into, the nitty and the gritty, these are how many autofocusing points I really have that can get the job done. That's how I look at autofocusing when I look at a camera. I don't look at a camera and say, wow, this thing has 100 autofocusing points and I'm going to be able to use these all the time. No, that's not how I do it. What I do is I look at the autofocusing points that actually have the performance value tied into them. Because in the end, that's what makes the difference when it comes to a camera from an autofocusing end. Now, the Canon, of course, in terms of autofocusing, like I said, is going to be about, for the sake of the conversation, we'll say a third slower than the Pentax, just from sheer autofocusing speed. Now, here's the other thing you got to keep in mind, okay, is that is based off of the Pentax K5 system, not the K5 II system / K5 IIS system, which is faster than the 5 system. It's just no one's tested the speed yet for hardcore numbers. So we don't know how much faster it is. We just know it's faster. Now, after using the camera myself, I can definitely tell you it's fast enough. It definitely is. Which brings me to my next point. When you talk about exposure value, on the Canon side, we're talking about a -2 in terms of exposure value. It's basically where the unit bottoms out and says, I can't do it anymore. The Pentex's is a -3 exposure value. Now, I can tell you for a fact, the Pentax, when it comes to autofocusing and when it comes to low light autofocusing, that thing is a monster. It is a complete monster. The 5D Mark III just doesn't have that robust performance in terms of low light. It just doesn't have it. And it's not to say that the camera is necessarily inferior because of that. What more or less you would be saying is that it's just not geared to be a speed demon when it comes to low lit autofocus based situations. Now think about what this really means, okay? In terms of what makes sense. All right, if you are a person who wants to be a wedding photographer, or if you're a person who wants to do, indoor activities, okay, or if you're a person who just ends up with the luck of the draw being in some, compromising lit situation, all right, or compromising light-based situation, then this is where having a -3 exposure value really plays to your advantage. It does. Especially when you look at the fact that the Canon runs 3000 and the Pentax only runs 12,000, and you can still get two premier lenses from the Pentax brand that allow you to utilize that autofocusing capability. Like, for example, a 16 to 50, or a 50 to 135, which are both 2.8 base lenses with the ultrasonic motor in them and all that fun stuff there. That's one of the things that you really do have to consider when you're talking about these cameras in the way that they're set up. The autofocusing speed goes to the Pentax. Now, the Canon shoots at 6 frames a second, the Pentax shoots at 7 frames a second. I'm really not going to sit up here and pick on that, except if you're talking about you need something like a golf swing. If you want to be able to nail down a golf swing, 7 frames a second is where you need to be. It works a whole lot better than 6. And, heck, honestly, if you can go faster than that, once again, it's a, more frames you have for a golf swing, the better. Now, with these units, okay, the most noticeable difference that you're going to have in these cameras, especially if you're talking about how the cameras are set up, is going to be the way they are able to output their HDR, and not only the HDR aspect, but the fine-tuning of the picture. One of the major downfalls that you have with the Canon 5D Mark III, like I said, is its color balance. But another thing is this camera is basically a first generation HDR based camera from the perspective of where Canon's going. In other words, Canon's trying to get into the whole concept of having better exposures and what have you not. But, they're not a Fuji brand. They're not a Pentax brand. And this is something that you have to decide in your camera. One of the big differences between the Pentax and the Canon is with the Canon, you can go with their customization system, and like I said, you look at the white. The white's yellowish. It's warm. Your colors are still off. Where with the Pentax, when you calibrate your system there, first off, you already know what the image is going to look like before you take it. That's number one. Okay? Number two, when you take that image and when you play it back, it looks exactly how it looked before you took it. In other words, your purity of white is truly pure. Your reds are red like they're supposed to be. Your greens, your blues, your oranges. Look at the color palette between the Canon and the Pentax. At any given ISO range, look at the color palette. And you will see that the Canon is heavily inconsistent, and where the Pentax keeps its consistency. When you're talking about a level of professionalism within the camera body, and I'm not talking about going, to Adobe Lightroom and trying to fix everything there. There's a complete difference in shooting styles with a Pentax and a Canon, and this is one of the biggest differences in terms of shooting styles. Not to mention, if you do shoot with a Pentax, after you've taken the picture, let's say that you want the white to be a little more warmer, or the image as a whole, we'll say, just to be a little more warmer. You can make those corrections right inside the camera, so poof, when the camera spits the image out to you, it looks exactly how you saw it in the camera. This is a fundamental weakness that, the Mark III has right now. Now, the reason why this is relevant is because by Canon's own admission, with their concepts of their, dual-layered I want to say 63 zone metering system that they're going after, and the in HDR aspects that they're trying to deal with now, which they've been piecemealing them together in other models like the 60D and the 70, so on and so forth. But now everything is starting to just combine itself into the Mark III. That's where you have a lot of this stuff trying to play out to fruition. In all honesty, I've been able to do this forever and a day in my Pentax K20D. And that thing's like as old as molasses now. I mean, it's pretty old. It's been around for a long ass time. You're talking 6, 7 years old. That's how old my camera is at this point. And everything that Canon's looking to do now in this Mark III, I can do in my K20D. Not to mention that, by now we're talking about the K5 II or the K5 IIS. And they can go well even beyond what my camera can. So as you go through this video here, keep in mind that one camera runs 3,000 plus, and that's the Canon. The other camera runs 1,200 plus, which is the Pentax. Factor in this performance. Factor in the image quality. Factor in the speed. Factor in the concept of manual output in terms of workflow of image quality within the camera. And then look at it and say which one is worth what they're really asking for in terms of price. For me, hands down, it's the Pentax. I've used both cameras and I can tell you, the Mark III is a nice unit. It's very nicely built. But it's still not $3,000 worth. It's just not. But in all fairness, if you remember, we did the test against the Nikon D800. And nobody had a problem with that when it was proven that that thing wasn't worth $3,300. Or whatever price I got it at now. This is one of the things you have to be careful about when you talk about full frame units versus a compact unit. This is one of those things that you have to be careful about in terms of sensors. You don't buy into a sensor concept just because the manufacturer says, hey, this is the natural progression of things. What you have to do is you have to look at the imaging processor. You also have to look at, the color palette of what the camera, produces in terms of its colors and what have you not. You've also got to look at, I want to say, the actual system in terms of autofocusing and things like that. Those are the kind of things that actually make a camera what it's worth at the price point that it's at. This is the main thing that separates Canon from Pentax at this point in time, people. If you are looking at a Mark III, a 5D Mark III, then you now know, just based on what I gave you here, you have another alternative. And, you can go either way. But like I said, I've used both cameras. I don't see the true advantage there in the Mark III except for one simple thing. Our Digix 5 processor has made the ISO corrections that needed to be made against the Mark II at the time that it was made. So, with that being said, you guys take care, and I'll talk to you later. All right, bye-bye.